Vamos a continuar con la mesa 1. Como es continuación, no voy a hacer una presentación del contenido de la mesa. Lo único que mencionaría es que hace un mes que fue el Congreso Mundial de Energía en Corea, hubo una sesión titulada como pregunta: ¿será Norteamérica independiente desde el punto de vista de energéticos primarios para 2025? Y obviamente la discusión fue muy interesante, con puntos de vista optimistas y pesimistas, ¿no? Nuestros panelistas hoy en esta sesión vamos a empezar con el doctor Robert Skinner. El doctor Robert Skinner estudió geología en Queen's University y obtuvo el doctorado también en geología en la Universidad de Washington en Seattle. Es consultor e investigador independiente. Actualmente asesora a la Universidad de Calgary en su estrategia de investigación energética. Su carrera como experto en energía abarca más de 4 décadas de trabajo en el gobierno, la industria y la academia. De 1970 a 1989 laboró en el Departamento de Energía de Canadá, encargado de investigación geológica, diseño de políticas energéticas y medioambientales y regulación de mercados. Entre 1989 y 1995 fue director de la Oficina de Política de la Agencia Internacional de Energía de la OSD en París. Dejó el servicio público en 1995 para unirse a la empresa Total, a la que asesoró para abrir una oficina en Calgary en 1998. De 2003 a 2006 dirigió el Oxford Institute of Energy Studies y a su regreso a Canadá se unió a Statoil, en donde trabajó hasta el 2011. Robert.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in Mexico again. The last time I was here was in 2006, and I had and this fellow here, Bernardo, got me involved in that, to go to a very nice hacienda up in Querétaro and have a discussion with your Senate committee who was concerned about the assumption for oil prices for national budgets. That's something that Canada goes through, and most recently Alberta has gone through it again, and I've been involved in very interesting discussions with Alberta government about what price assumptions they should make, because they have been through the volatility that Ed Morse and Michelle have described. If I can get these slides operating here. This works. I'm going to talk about Canada as a resource economy and where resources fit in the economy very briefly, and then talk about some of the developments and the issues on oil and gas, and then close on with a map of Canada and its discontentos about oil and gas in particular, and then about the Canada-U.S. energy relationship, which is a kind of an on-again and off-again love affair. And I will leave it to you to judge as to what is the status of the relationship at the moment. But natural resources, as a share of Canada's GDP, they're large, but not that large, about 14%, and declining as a share. But if you look at the very bottom, the oil and gas or the energy sector is an increasingly large share. And in terms of exports, you can see two developments in the last little while. Energy is expanding its share, and automobiles is shrinking its share. Now, that doesn't mean that the value of the exports are necessarily going in those directions. But those two opening and closing wedges, along with the agricultural one at the bottom, which is increasing, are at the core of some internal geopolitical discussions and tensions. Just to build on what Michelle said, Canada has a totally different resource governance structure than the United States. Our provinces are as sovereign with respect to oil and gas as is Mexico with respect to its oil and gas. And our provinces very jealously guard any attempts to invade on the rent of their oil and gas, whether it be internally, fiscally from the central government, the federales, or whether it's other provinces over which oil and gas will be transported. Oil sands, we have an immense resource. I'm sure you've seen these slides before. I'll just quickly go through, but 168, 169 billion barrels of reserves, about 1.8 trillion barrels of bitumen in place, and the magenta-colored carbonate play is one that just 5 years ago the government authorities of Alberta didn't show on the resource map, and there are at least 3 companies that are piloting projects to develop the carbonate using steam injection or combinations of electrical heating and steam. That oil play, the carbonate, interestingly, is about the same size and shape as the massive Hawar oil field in Saudi Arabia. Just to go back, the mining area is in the very small boxed off area with the dashed lines. There is a lot of resource in what I call the donut around the mining area, which is too deep to mine and too shallow to use steam injection or the in situ techniques. And there are some technologies that are being developed that would go after that resource. Canada's oil sands in a global context, of those countries listed there account for the bulk of the world's oil reserves, and 90%. And in terms of mining versus in situ right now, the production is about 50-50, 52% mining to be precise. Of the oil that is open to international private companies, that sort of 19%, 56% is in the Canadian oil sands. Now, I'm going to say here that, and I'll get back to it later, but we've had a recent decision last year that we're not entirely open. The government, the federal government, has an investment, a foreign investment regulation, and that if you acquire a company that's worth more than $323 billion or whatever it is now, then you've got to go through this investment review process, and you've got to make undertakings of Canadianization, Canadian management, etc., employment. And they recently allowed a state-owned enterprise from China, CNOOC, to buy Nexen, which is a Canadian company, which originally was Occidental Petroleum's subsidiary in Canada, which went out on an IPO. But the federal government said from now on, that's not going to be the case. And the rationale is that the federal government said, look, we have done a lot to get the government out of the oil industry and out of many industries over the last 20 years in our microeconomic reform. We're not about to stand here and allow other governments to own our resources. Isn't that a strange counterpoint to what's going on in Mexico, where your concern is about private companies owning Mexican resources? Our concern is about foreign countries, governments, owning and making the decision-making on the development of this massive resource. Oil production changes in 2011, the World Energy Outlook of the IEA, they saw that I'm going to have to go to my paper copy because I can't see that small screen. They saw that Iraq was going to be playing a bigger role. And this is in terms of contributions to future oil supply in the world. You can see with the yellow and red that very much unconventional oil, that is oil sands and heavy oil, ultra heavy oil, and tight oil was going to be playing the big role. They changed their view a little bit this year in last week's World Energy Outlook. Iraq a little less, Brazil a little less, Canada a little less, etc. But the United States, much greater role, and Russia. Just to summarize their view, it was that non-OPEC and unconventional liquids were expected to play an increasing role and a less role for OPEC. That's out to about 2020, and then OPEC would come back to play an expanding role. In terms of natural gas in Canada, in 2000, our resource estimators thought that we had 70 years of supply, 390 TCF. 2010, that was increased to these horrific numbers that we've seen, 700 to 1,300. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the National Energy Board said the one formation alone, the Montney Formation, which is that one up in the left-hand corner, the yellow one, which is equivalent, the same, geologically equivalent to the Bakken and to the shales in the Antrim. Contains about 450 TCF and over 1 billion barrels of marketable crude and 14.5 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. Of course, Canada confronts, looks at a world where the future demand in oil is going to be in the Asia-Pacific, China and India in particular, and therefore our oil, we want to look over the Rocky Mountains and get it to that market, and that is a challenge. In 6 months in the current year, we've had a pretty interesting time when it's come to unconventional oil and gas. The upper left-hand corner was a derailment about a month ago in northern Alberta, and it was basically some NGL tanks that that derailed and punctured and were on fire. The one in the upper right-hand corner is the extremely tragic accident in Lac Mégantic in Quebec, where 47 people in that village were killed when a unit train let go at night. It was on a station on a hill a few kilometers away and ended up going through the town at breakneck speed, and the tank cars all came off, punctured, ignited, exploded in fact, and the oil flowed down the streets into basements and into houses and apartments and pubs and killed 47 people. The one on the lower left is a tank cars that were of condensate used as diluent for the bitumen. And the river was in historic flood. We had a major flood in Calgary, doing billions of dollars of damage. And these tank cars were suspended as the abutment got eroded. That bridge had been inspected 14 times within 24 hours, but nonetheless, it was damaged. The other one is occurred about a month ago in New Brunswick. 7 police cars were set on fire by Aboriginals protesting proposals to frack for natural gas. In Canada, I would say we are a country with excessive government. In some areas, cities, you can be under 5 governments or influenced by 5 levels of government. It's almost as bad as Europe. We are over-governmented, if I can use a word like that. We are a resource economy to a large extent. And as I said, oil and gas is accounting for a lot of it now, whose elites tend to oppose the development of natural resources. We are a high-cost oil and gas province in a softening market with lots of competition. Our First Nations or Aboriginals have a 97% batting average, winning average in the Supreme Court on their rights, certain rights for consultation, etc., for resource development, and they can bring any project to a stop. Natural gas, the revenues are down. The whole west to east flow model has been turned upside down. U.S. gas from the Marcellus is moving up into that market. The pipelines are in tariff spiral, death spiral, and looking at converting to oil. The industry has three major issues, at least. Access to capital for some, not the big IOCs, ExxonMobil, et cetera, but for the mid-sized and the large cap Canadian companies. And access to skilled labor and access to markets. And that diversification of markets is a very compelling geopolitical issue in Canada. Within Alberta, we have gas revenues are going down, and that ironically reduces the capacity of the oil sand industry to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas because gas is so cheap, being efficient with heat exchangers and so on. The economics are just not there. The drilling is the same kind of picture we've seen in the United States, drilling efficiencies, where the drilling industry is way down in terms of number of wells drilled, but way up in terms of number of meters drilled, reflecting the large horizontal multi-frac wells and multilateral wells as well. Turning to natural gas, we have a growing list of LNG projects proposed for the West Coast. I won't describe them. Two of them, at least two as of today, have their export permits. None has gone to final financial decision, but there's a total potential pull out of the basin of over 13 BCF a day should most of those projects go ahead. But it's not easy. The west coast of Canada is a very remote and beautiful part of the country. There are communities there, obviously, but this is a detailed map showing where the LNG and one of the major oil pipeline terminals being proposed, the Northern Gateway, would come out at Kitimat. There are a lot of issues. These projects are not going to be there for the discounted cash flow, net present value 15-year calculation. They'll be there for many years. And these are fracked wells with those decline rates, but very dramatic initial production, requiring not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of wells over the life of these LNG projects. And this is not, the industry thinks it's easily done, but it's not all that obvious. There are some technical issues with fracking, and at the University of Calgary, where I'm advising on their energy research strategy, we're doing some work. In fact, we're developing a center of hydraulic fracturing and looking at some of the issues. There's some very micro issues that need proper scientific inquiry. The industry is too ready to say everything's fine, no problems, the gas doesn't get in the water, da-da-da-da. Yes, but the industry today is not what the industry was when George Mitchell sent his crew out to experiment in the Fort Worth area. I'll just skip along here. And also that BC LNG is in a very crowded lineup of prétendeurs wanting to get access to that market that Ed described, which is also being contested by Russia, being contested by Australia, which is out ahead of us, being contested by US Gulf Coast LNG projects, and also by Mozambique and Tanzania, potentially. You can have these slides when I'm finished. In terms of oil outlook, this is the Industry Association's outlook for oil sands and conventional oil. Just very quickly, our oil production and supply outlook, you wonder why the supply is higher than the outlook. It's because we're importing condensate coming out of the shale gas in the United States to dilute our bitumen to export it out, and why it was, in the early time, why it was less, because we convert a lot of that production through cokers and upgraders. In terms of Mexico's focus on where this northern Mexican is going to be coming from, with a competing supply that Bernardo discussed, and Pedro Haas, there's a lot of supply coming out of these projects. But bear in mind, I've been looking at unconventional oil for over 15 years. In fact, I first saw the oil sands as a young geologist in 1966. But there's one thing about the oil sands, and that is that its future never comes. I've been looking at projections of projects that go up to 6, 7, 8 million barrels a day by 2015. That future never comes. We'll get there eventually. We don't have the decline rates of shale oil in the U.S. We have a bitumen bubble. We have a problem with the price. And others referred to that differential. Pedro talked about a $65 differential between Western Canada Select, which is our diluted bitumen, has an API similar to Maya, a different acid, different sulfur, obviously a little higher sulfur. But recently that dropped down to $42. It was $42 in the summer. Normally, if the WTI is $100, we would expect WCS to sell into Cushing at about $18 or $20 less, say $80. Not at the horrific discount. Maya this summer was selling higher than WTI, and WCS is like $50, $60 less than its equivalent oil. Strange world we live in. In terms of pipelines and the takeaway capacity for this burgeoning growth, I mean, the industry talks, yes, we are having these projects come on, and just this last week we had 3 major projects announced, new projects, an expansion, the next phase of the Curl Lake mining project, a new mining project by Suncor and Total, and a new in situ project by Shell over in the Peace River heavy oil play. So the industry isn't looking at this current chit-chat of the elites in Canada and the knitting of fingers about whether the pipeline is going to go through my province and whether my province is going to get any money from your province. And this endless debate among 35 million Canadians that have too much and can't make a decision on something that's so little. We have pipelines, we have millions of kilometers of pipelines in North America. We have built pipelines north, south, east, west in North America without any complaint. The Trans Mountain pipeline from Edmonton over to Vancouver went through a UNESCO site, Jasper National Park. It was expanded a few years ago in the 90s, and nobody even said boo. And now it's the end of the world if we build these pipelines. And James Hansen, the former chief scientist of NASA, says that if the Keystone pipeline down to Cushing, if that goes ahead, quote, it means the end of the world as we know it, unquote. If you do the calculations, now he's got a PhD and so do I did the calculations. If we use the same technologies that we have used today and develop those 169 billion barrels of oil sands reserves, the world ended on April 14th, and it will end every 142 days from now on because of the world growth in CO2. That's supposed to be funny. There are 4 coal-fired power stations in the United States, in Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and I forget, Kentucky, I think. They produce the same amount of CO2 per year as the oil sands altogether. I don't hear President Obama complaining about those. But, you know, meantime, we have the railroads, the oldest technology that got Rockefeller going, and here we go again. And this is what the Russians did, actually, when things weren't going so well in Russia. They transported oil by rail, but it costs a lot of money. But you can access all 3 coasts. You got tremendous flexibility. It doesn't require diluent. And you can backhaul diluent for the pipelines from the Gulf Coast and so on. And there are safety issues. And we had a bumper crop of canola oil, or grain oil this summer, and wheat. And now the farmers are complaining because they can't get their crops to market because the railways are all plugged up with these damn tank cars. I was out on my bicycle a month ago before the snows came, and I was watching this. It was a very pleasant evening, and I was watching these trains go by. Well, the new ones, these are new tank cars, and then the old ones. And you can tell they're the new ones because they don't have a graffiti on them and so on. But from my office window at the university, I see these unit trains going by with the shiny cars. over 900,000 barrels a day of loading capacity being built out will be built out by early next year in Canada. That's loading. In terms of movements, we're only about 175 or 200,000 barrels a day. I want to end on a map of Canada's oil and gas hidrocarburos discontentos, and this is I'm being unfair to some of the provinces and territories. I left out the ones in between. They're mostly socialists, and and I put Ontario in there because that's where Toronto is, our biggest city with our biggest mayor with the biggest problem. And I understand he's made news here in Mexico. Isn't this wonderful? In Calgary, we have a Muslim mayor, and he is 90% popular. Anyway, oil sands, we have, of course, greenhouse gas regulations. These are coming. There are going to be a lot of decisions in the next few months. Water issues, land issues, First Nations issues. We have the state-owned enterprise investment policy, access to capital. I mentioned those things. Market diversification going west. There are 2 pipeline proposals, a Northern Gateway proposal and the Trans Mountain expansion, which together would be about 1.3, 1.4 million barrels a day. And then we have, we want to get it down to Hardisty or down to the border. We have a lot of options being talked about going east, converting TransCanada's old gas, not that old, gas pipeline that's not carrying enough gas. And then there are issues of reversing the old crude oil line, line number 9, that went from Sarnia to Montreal and was done in 1977 because we were concerned about OPEC, and also we wanted to get Quebec onto the umbilicus of Canadian Western oil. And then we reversed it to go to Sarnia for imported oil when it was cheap, and now we want to do it back. But oh my goodness, it's a big environmental problem to reverse this pipeline. And now Ontario and Quebec are wondering if they can get some money for enduring the pain of having this awful oil sands, world-ending crude oil go across their territory. It's after coffee and before lunch. And then there are these new pipelines, but Canada never ends on gas. We have production is decreasing. We're importing gas into the east, and our exports are way down. Quebec does not want fracking in the St. Lawrence Basin of the Utica shales, the same shales that would be fracked over in New York, the same formation, where the people own the mineral rights, but in Quebec they don't own the mineral rights. So follow the money. That's always, for students, that's the earliest, that's the easiest thing. Occam's razor, it's the easiest explanation. And the other fracking in New Brunswick is the picture I showed you of the 7 police cars. And then, of course, we have the issue of Mr. Obama and what legacy he wants to leave. And I'm going to be very serious because I think he could be the first prime minister or for the first president of the United States to leave a lasting legacy with Canada, and a once and for all legacy for Canada, that they only want us when they need us. And I'm going to end with this slide that in the 1940s, Canada, during the war, Second World War, built an oil pipeline from the Norman Wells oil field in the Mackenzie Valley up over Yukon to the west coast to help in the war effort against against the Japanese. In the 1950s, the PAD District 5 realized, the U.S. realized, oh my goodness, against the Korean War, we're concerned, we can't get oil to the Koreans. So we passed an act of parliament to expedite the Trans Mountain pipeline that is now wanting to be expanded, an act of it was built in 2 years, in 1953. 1960s, the U.S. imposed import restrictions. We had just discovered a bunch of oil. We begged them to take our oil. The history goes on. 1980s, we went into we actually passed a bill to expedite the Northern Pipeline, and the story goes on. I just want to say that even though we have all these problems, in my view, we will get by them. The decisions are being made, regulatory decisions are being made, and the industry will accept those decisions and find ways, as they always have, to live with them. Thank you.
Nuestro siguiente ponente es la maestra Amrita. Cursó la licenciatura en Economía en la Universidad de Warwick y tiene la maestría en Economía de la Universidad de Cambridge y obtendrá su doctorado en la Escuela de Estudios Orientales y Africanos de la Universidad de Londres. Es analista principal de los mercados petroleros y socia en la consultoría Energy Aspects. Es asociada en el Oxford Institute of Energy Studies y fue analista principal en Barclays Capital. Se especializa en el estudio de los mercados de commodities, en particular petróleo y sus derivados, transporte y flujos de inversión. Es reconocida analista en prensa y televisión, escribe y aparece con frecuencia en el Financial Times, en BBC News, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal y Sky News, entre otros. All yours.
Thank you. I might need the presentation. Yeah, found it. Thank you so much, and Celia in particular, for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here. I was given a very interesting topic, the topic of the growth of North American unconventional oil and gas. Does it endanger OPEC's role in the oil market? It's a fancy way of putting the Persian Gulf's predominance endangered, but it is a very important topic. As you've heard through the last few hours, the views are quite split. There are those who believe that the shale revolution is a huge game changer, in which case OPEC's role will be diminished. There are those who believe this is probably a flash in the pan and it's probably not going to be that big a deal, in which case OPEC will remain important going forward. And the reason it's important is because what's the message we are sending to OPEC? As Bob said as well earlier, the IEA's latest World Energy Outlook, it was quite a U-turn because they were very, very bullish about the whole shale in North America. They called for U.S. independence in the last WEO. This WEO, they turned around and said, oh, hang on, by 2020, we're going to need OPEC oil again. And this swing is quite an important factor, because if we are sending the message to OPEC that, you know what, we don't need your oil, we are more than comfortable without your oil, then there will be investment decisions made or not made in OPEC that can have an important implication for future oil prices. After all, OPEC is the only kind of region, in particular Saudi Arabia, that maintains spare capacity, has the discipline to maintain spare capacity. And that's what I'm going to take you through in terms of in my presentation. Some of the slides, some of the topics you have heard from our previous speakers in the morning, so I apologize, but it's kind of providing the context in that basis. U.S. shale, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. We have talked a lot about it over the last few hours. North Dakota in particular, but Eagle Ford, two huge basins growing very, very fast. And, these pictures don't lie. Clearly, U.S. production is growing tremendously quickly, breached 11 million barrels per day, levels last seen in the 1980s, and it is growing very, very quickly, for sure. And again, this is something Ed talked about as well. There is a huge amount of euphoria around shale elsewhere, as I call it. Argentina, Russia, China. Geologists and economists, I'd say, are quite split between where we will end up. Geologists argue, and this is something I've seen data from companies like Schlumberger and Baker Hughes, the kind of data you have for the US basins, you just simply don't have that for anywhere else in the world other than Argentina. Argentina is the only other country in the world where you have hundreds of years' worth of data. Doesn't mean shale in other parts of the world don't happen. It will happen. It's just going to be slower. It's going to be stops and starts. It's not going to be as smooth a ride as the US has seen. Costs, service companies, mineral rights, everybody over here has mentioned mineral rights, huge issues. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a caution in terms of not saying that it's not going to develop, it's how quickly it develops, and that's important because, again, projects Each and every project, whether it be non-OPEC, whether it be OPEC, takes time. There are delays, there are cost overruns. And when you get these shocks, when you get shocks of, say, 1 or 2 million barrels per day, either of projects getting delayed or, for instance, coming online, it can lead to a lot of volatility in the market. And that is, of course, of a huge, huge concern in terms of whether you're a producer or an investor. Reality today is we've seen 3 years of US oil production growth of 1 million barrels per day. Unprecedented levels of growth, no doubt about that. Prices are still $100. And yes, you've seen volatility. Intraday volatility has been very, very high. Pedro talked about this as well, WTI, Brent. So your differentials have really taken the hit. You've seen all sorts of differentials, not just in North America, but even outside North America, because of the type of oil shale is. In terms of the lightness of it, you have seen light-heavy differentials come in as well. Yes, but in terms of price levels, it's been fairly constant. We've been range-bound between broadly $90 per barrel and $120 per barrel. Ultimately, for a producer, it's price averages that matter. You're not going to look at daily volatility and make your investment decisions or your budget decisions. If you look at the OPEC basket price, it's basically constant between 105 and 110. It has been for the last 12 quarters. That's important because despite all the disruptive growth in the US, clearly there's been something going on elsewhere that we haven't felt the volatility, at least on the downside yet. And if anything, even today, this year, we had to rely on Saudi Arabia to pump 10 million barrels per day for 3 months in order to balance the market. Even during exactly those 3 months, US oil production was growing at 1 million barrels per day, if not higher. So that's very, very important to put the US shale growth in the global context and see where are the offsetting factors. Today, the world is still reliant on OPEC oil. So there are a lot of talks about the call on OPEC crude is going to be lower. Every year, key agency forecasts and a lot of other market participants will talk about the forecast for the call on OPEC crude, i.e. how much OPEC has to produce to balance the market getting lower and lower. Yes, it fluctuates a little bit, but on the whole, it's around 30 million barrels per day. By historical standards, this is very, very high. Go back to the 1970s, 1980s. OPEC will be very happy if they can produce around 29 to 31 million barrels per day. They're not going to complain about a high-cost producer coming in. And I think the IEA's call on OPEC chart, it's slightly complicated. What I'm trying to do over here is I've graphed back when the IEA first made the call on OPEC crude for that particular year and all the way through to the full year and year after, because they keep revising it higher and higher. You can see 2012, they started at 30 million barrels per day. Today, the 2012's call on OPEC is 31.3 million barrels per day. Bottom line is that they've ended up revising the call on OPEC crude higher and higher because you start off the year thinking, yes, there are all these non-OPEC supply growths, and something happens, offsetting factors, which ends up making OPEC needing to supply the oil market with more and more crude. Non-OPEC supplies. I'll start with non-OPEC supplies. Yes, it's, we talked about shale. We've talked about shale a lot today. But is it only about shale? Are there other centers that we need to be worried about or we should be looking at? Rest of non-OPEC has been a pretty disappointing story. Last 3 years has been disappointing. Yes, I think going forward, I expect the rest of non-OPEC to look a little bit better. No doubt about that. But it's important, especially in the oil market. Remember, prices are a reflection of expectations. It's expectations of future growth in demand and supply. Even if on absolute terms, production outside North America does improve, it's nowhere close to what expectations have been in terms of where they were set, say, 5 years ago. First country I'll mention is Brazil. If we were here 5 years ago, I think we would have spent as much time on Brazil as we spend today on shale. Brazil was going to join OPEC. Brazil was going to be the next big thing. It doesn't mean Brazil doesn't have the resources. It definitely does, and I expect Brazilian production to grow next year, one, because the base effect is so weak, but 16 out of the last 17 months, Brazilian production has declined. Again, not because of the lack of resources, it's about what Michelle talked about, what Pedro's talked about as well. It's about above-ground constraints. Petrobras' problems, cost overruns, and again, look at IEA's Brazilian forecast. All we've seen over the last few years is that it's still an upward-sloping graph. it's just been revised. It's a parallel shift lower. In 2008, the IEA expected by 2013 Brazilian production to be 3.1 million barrels per day. Today, Brazilian production is 2.1 million barrels per day. So again, expectations versus reality, there has been a mismatch. North Sea, I don't need to spend a lot of time on North Sea. We know it's declining. There are some, I think Norway's doing a little bit better. It'll continue to do a little bit better. But again, on the grand scheme of things, these are still declining markets. FSU, very, very important. A lot of hype. Russia is doing well, and I've been positive about Russia for a while, and I think Russia will continue to grow at around 100,000 barrels per day. But a lot of hype about Kashagan, the biggest oil field in the world, but also the most costly oil field in the world. It came online after 10 years of delay. It took 13 years to bring that field online. Guess how many days it operated for? 2 weeks. Went offline because it has a gas processing problem. If you're telling me after 13 years you couldn't solve that gas processing problem, there are inherent issues with the kind of fields we are developing. They are in areas which are more and more challenging. It doesn't mean, this by no means means that this is peak oil. No, we have plenty of oil in the world, but the acknowledgement that we are drilling in more challenging locations, whether it be geologically, whether it be technologically, is important, because naturally you're going to see cost overruns, and naturally you're going to see project delays, because now, if you looked at all estimates for non-OPEC supply, Kashagan was built into Q4 13 forecasts, and it was built into 2014 forecasts. Now the operators are saying it's probably not going to come online before May 2014. That's a delay of almost 9 months. So expectations, and again in terms of balances, you have to again downwardly adjust non-OPEC supply balances, automatically meaning that OPEC has to supply more crude. This is a slightly difficult slide for you to read. Bottom line on this, in fact, I can probably move on to the next slide. If you look at the rows highlighted in bold, this, by the way, we've collected information for all the majors, oil majors around the world, and this is the average. Brent, the 10-year average growth in prices is 16%. How much has revenues gone up by for these companies on average? 13%. Why? Because finding costs, just generally costs, have increased by more than what the price of oil has increased by, which is why their revenues have lagged behind. A better way of showing this, I'll come back to this, is this chart here. Liquids production, obviously this is indexed, and again this is across all the majors. Liquids production from 2000 has actually flatlined. It's quite a remarkable chart if you look at how much capex has increased vis-a-vis how much liquids has increased. It basically underlines the problem in the oil market. Costs are going up. And reasons why costs are going up, deep water costs are going up, decline rates are very, very high. The decline rate exercise over here is just after the moratorium post-Macondo. Now things are slightly different, and deep water should be growing. Not necessarily a lot next year, but 2015, 2016 definitely look like big, big project years for us, to us. So yeah, you will see that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we will go to a low cost or low price environment. We need the high price to be able to continue drilling and to be able to generate the non-OPEC supply growth that everybody's talked about here today. The causality is important. We are here today, we are here in shale today because oil has been at $100 for 3 years. Shale has been around for decades, by the way. We've never drilled it, A, because it's a poor quality resource, and B, because the price wasn't right. At the end of the day, whether it be Canadian oil sands, whether it be shale, and absolutely there are efficiency gains and costs are coming down, but they don't match up to OPEC. OPEC is still the low-cost producer, particularly Saudi Arabia, Iraq as well, and you need to give some kind of importance to that, because their profit margins are obviously very, very high as well, which means that they can, particularly Saudis again, they can swing in and out of the market a lot quicker than a lot of these non-OPEC suppliers can, because the costs are much higher, which means they need to keep producing to be able to make up their revenues, whereas the Saudis can cut quite a bit of production before it affects any of their bottom line with regards to revenues. Slightly technical, and I know we haven't talked about a lot of this, though Michelle mentioned a little bit of this, but more on the gas side. Is shale the right quality of oil that is being produced? Yes, it's 1 million barrels per day. Look at where shale sits with regards to API. API is essentially how light or heavy the crude oil is. We are losing out in terms of the declines I've showed you. I've showed you North Sea, I've showed you some of Brazil, some FSU. We are losing out between 30 and 40 API of crude oil. That's your sweet spot. That's what's called light sweet crude oil. We are also losing some heavy stuff, but in general, that's what we are losing, the light sweet crude oil. We are replacing that with 50 or 55 API crude oil, which is shale. Clearly, it's not a like-for-like substitute. In any case, the lighter the crude, the energy equivalent should be lower. In general, you'd say condensates and NGLs are 2/3 of what a pure crude oil barrel is. Yes, refineries are very flexible, and I personally think the market doesn't give refineries enough credit for being how flexible they are. They're going to blend for sure, but there will still be some limits. And the limits come precisely because of the fact that the refining capacity additions, we have huge amounts of refining capacity additions, but the limitations come from the fact that bulk of these refinery capacity additions are geared towards processing heavy crude oil. 5 years ago, if you asked anybody in the refining sector what was the quality of the marginal barrel of crude oil, it was going to be heavy. It was going to be Venezuelan Orinoco Basin, it was going to be Brazilian heavy and Canadian heavy, particularly in the US Gulf Coast, very important for Mexico as well. What's happened today, fast forward 5 years, zero of the Brazilian heavy pretty much comes in. Why? Because their domestic production has disappointed and domestic consumption has absolutely soared. Canadian problems, Bob's literally kind of pointed out all the issues with pipelines. That's the issue. Canadian crude is not coming to the extent it should be coming to the Gulf Coast. Venezuela, well, it hasn't developed the potential it has to develop. And that's why we have a mismatch, a huge mismatch between light crudes that are being produced and heavy crudes. It's fine to do the numbers, and increasingly I personally think we almost need to do separate crude oil balances in the world, split out the light balances versus the heavy balances, because even Asian crude oils, even Asian refineries, all of them wanted the cheaper heavy crude oils, and it's not there. If you think about Asia, Middle East now, which has, by the way, they are building a lot of refineries, they are going to process their own cheap heavy crude oil. So Asia is essentially reliant on Mexico, on Venezuela, on Colombia, to Ecuador, and to a certain extent Sudan for heavy crude oil. Angola, but Angola is not as heavy as some of these countries. Mexico, by the way, can go east, and it has a huge market there for heavy crude oils. It doesn't have to rely on the US Gulf Coast only. I know this could be slightly controversial with regards to relationships and so on, but it is important because there is a market for Mexican heavy crude oil. To be fair, there's a market for Mexican heavy crude oil in the US Gulf Coast because the quality of crude oil from the Eagle Ford is super light, and there is a case to be made for swaps between the light crude of the Eagle Ford with the Mexican Maya. But there you go, that's the issue. Again, coming back to the shale, and I think this is something Pedro talked about, we've done a big study on this in terms of the profitability. And again, this doesn't, negative cash flow doesn't mean anything in terms of the oil and gas industry. But it is very, very important to bear in mind that, the message we are sending, okay, there is a lot of non-OPEC supply growth, OPEC, we don't need your crude oil. Yet all the stuff I've shown you today, OPEC has been the kind of marginal supplier to the market even to date. And if this is a telling story, the fact that we have had to rack up so much debt in the shale business to generate growth, fine in a zero interest rate environment, 1% increase in interest rate can actually tell a very, very different story. And I come back to the point I made, it's about expectations. I personally don't expect that, I don't think the shale is a Ponzi game. No, not at all. But equally, I don't think shale is going to be 1 million barrels per day of growth for the foreseeable future. It's going to be somewhere in between. But if the market expectations are building in 1 million barrels per day of growth for the foreseeable future, any slowdown is going to be a nasty shock. Any slowdown will suddenly mean you need to recalibrate expectations in the forward curve, which will mean more volatility in prices in the short term and in the medium term. That's why it's important. And as I mentioned, I have to talk about this when I talk about OPEC. We talk about OPEC and we talk about, we talk about the group. Ultimately today, when we talk about OPEC, we talk about Saudi Arabia. That's the reality of it. OPEC countries outside the GCC, particularly in North Africa, are under tremendous pressure. Libya, structural problems with regards to salaries, with regards to autonomy. There is I personally don't think we're going to see a split Libya, but there are huge calls. There is a huge probability that it does escalate into civil war. Violence has been on the rise. Nigeria, it's a never-ending story. We know about Nigeria. I'm not going to spend time on it, but oil theft is a problem. Libya, we've basically lost 1.5 million barrels per day. Nigeria, we've lost another 200,000 to 300,000 barrels per day. Iran, we've lost 1 million barrels per day due to sanctions. Yes, we are expecting an interim deal in the meantime, probably not a lifting of the oil sanctions. Bigger question is, and this is an IEA number, by the way, not my own numbers, in terms of the production capacity. The IEA now says that Iran's production capacity is 2.9 million barrels per day. That's a drop of 600,000 barrels per day from where they were producing before the sanctions. So even if you lift the sanctions, can Iran even go up to 3 million barrels per day? That's a question to be asked. We know they have issues with decline rates. The fact is that some of those sanctions have been in place for decades, and they are struggling with lifting production. The national Iranian gas company just went bankrupt yesterday, for what it's worth. So OPEC output outside Saudi Arabia, and I'll throw in Kuwait and UAE in that mix as well. But that's the story it tells you, right? So these have been the offsetting factor. What has offset shale outside, basically in the global market? Very weak non-OPEC supply outside North America, particularly in 2011, parts of 2012. This year has been okay. What else has offset the shale growth? It's been OPEC production weakness in Libya, in Nigeria, Iraq as well. This year has been a big disappointment, Iran to a certain extent. So, of course, these are geopolitical issues, and you can never say with certainty. I get asked all the time, what's going to be the next 1 million barrels per day of loss? Because you have to kind of offset the shale growth to keep prices roughly at $100. You don't know. I don't know. If I knew, I probably wouldn't be here. I would be, trading that and making billions of dollars. But the reality is that given the track record of this industry, you can't assign a zero probability that there will be no outages. I think that's very important, and that's why it's important not to get carried away with assumptions that, shale is going to lead us to $70 oil environment, because there are a lot of inherent problems in this oil industry. This is just a map just showing the locations and how geopolitically problematic it is. This is a very important chart, and this is why I can't stress how important OPEC is and how important OPEC, and particularly Saudi Arabia, will be. Saudi Arabia, obviously I've stretched out the axis. You can see it's 1.5 million barrels per day. It's really not that much. Is the only country that actually maintains and is willing to maintain spare capacity. Libya, Iran, Nigeria, the so-called spare capacity they have is a function of the political backdrop in their country. Whenever there's a political disruption, you get spare capacity. I don't count that as spare capacity because you can't rely on that. You can't turn it on tomorrow and maintain it for 3 months. Saudi Arabia, certain extent Kuwait and UAE are the only countries in the world today that are willing to maintain spare capacity. And that is why you can't underestimate the role of OPEC. They are the ultimate stabilizers in the market. Saudi Arabia increased output to 10 million barrels per day, as I showed you in my earlier graphs. Now it's pulled back to 9.75 because A, domestic consumption has fallen seasonally, and B, as seasonally non-OPEC supply increases, Saudis don't need to give as much oil to the market, although their exports are still quite high. You can't, how can you underestimate that? That is your swing producer. Of course, oil is unique in the sense that your low-cost producer is your swing producer. In any other market, it's your high-cost producer that's your swing producer. But if all the things I showed you about shale are even remotely correct, if it pans out, shale companies in the US won't be able to cut back on production just because they need to keep drilling, A, to maintain production because their decline rates are so high, and B, in order to generate revenue. So the US, irrespective of how much it grows, can't really be the swing producer in terms of maintaining stable spare capacity in the market. That's why there is importance of OPEC and why we shouldn't be underestimating that. Two things I will say about Saudi Arabia and why they should be a little bit worried, and it is kind of concerning. For me, this is the key source of instability in the future for oil prices, much more than shale. One is Iraq. Now, and I have said this before as well, to other people, other groups, and I'll mention this here as well. Saudi Arabia is not really bothered about US shale. At the end of the day, it's a high-cost producer. Accommodating a high-cost producer, they did the same for Russia, is much, much easier. What bothers them is a low-cost producer. What bothers them is Iraq. And Iraq and Saudis obviously never have had a great relationship. Iraqi production, bit like Canada, you've always get these huge production numbers. Oh, it's going to be 15 million barrels per day, 12 million barrels per day. Iraq has always been a case of you've always delayed that target and you've lowered the kind of time frame. So by 2015, you'll only get now to 3.5 million barrels per day, if that. So there are lots of issues with Iraq, but the potential is there. And what Iraq is doing now, and as you can see, this year has been a disappointment. In theory, next year should be better. And in order to gain market share, because their production has been so volatile, they are undercutting the Saudis. They are constantly undercutting Saudis in Asia. This is a worry, because the Saudis are fine to lose market share, so as to speak, let me rephrase, the Saudis are okay to cut back production if the market economically needs it, if there's an economic recession, or for whatever other reasons in order to balance the market. The Saudis are not willing to lower production because they're losing market share to a low-cost producer. And this is a source of concern because the Saudis, and we've heard enough rumblings from the Saudis saying, there is a red line. The red line is 9 million barrels per day for us and 4 million barrels per day for Iraq. Iraq then has to come under quotas. Iraq is the only OPEC country which is not under a quota system at the moment. This causes a lot of tensions. And the problem over here is that if you do get, and yes, we get a lot of talk about the Saudis needing $90 to maintain their budget. Not really. Yes, in the long term, they would like a high price. In the short term, they are very happy to consider $60, $70 oil for a year or two. $60, $70 oil, imagine what that would do to shale, imagine what that would do to Iran and Iraq, to be honest. The issue is if the Saudis ever decide, you know what, fine, let's go for this and let's see, what we've seen exactly in the 1990s, and yes, we will kind of keep our production at 9 million barrels per day and let's see what happens to prices, that is the most destabilizing factor, because at the end of the day, so far, it has been the Saudis that have kept the market very, very stable. And the other thing is Saudi's own domestic demand, and yes, we know domestic demand is rising. It's very seasonal. In the summers, you get the peak. And they are doing a lot. They've diversified into gas. This year was a very mild summer, so you didn't see the effect, but you can see every summer the exports dip. As they keep growing their domestic economy, this is going to be another headache they need to kind of maintain. They have more refining capacity now as well, domestically. So in order to kind of continue exercising the same effect or influence they've had on the market, these two factors are worth bearing in mind. The domestic demand is something they can control more. They are doing more on renewables and so on. But Iraq is the potential destabilizing factor from my point of view going forward. And depending, obviously, on how Iraq grows, there's no guarantee it's going to grow. And I think that's important because at the end of the day, without these two destabilizing factors, we are still reliant on Saudi oil. And we will remain reliant on Saudi oil, primarily because all the other sources of production are high cost. And two, because you have so many other disruptions in the world. And finally, if the shale boom turns out to be not as rosy a picture as what a lot of people are expecting, you are again going to rely on Saudi Arabia to come and fill that market. The worst thing we can do now is send the signal to them saying, don't invest. Come 2018 or 2017, we go back to them and say, yes, we need your oil. There won't be any oil left. So yeah, with that, I'm done. So.
Our last speaker today, before we go to comments, is Dr. Paul Stephen. Paul Stephen is professor. El doctor Stevens es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Dundee, asociado distinguido del Real Institute para Asuntos Internacionales de Londres, mejor conocido como Chatham House, y ofrece servicios de consultoría a compañías y a gobiernos. Estudió economía en la Universidad de Cambridge y se especializó en Medio Oriente en la Escuela de Estudios Orientales y Africanos de la Universidad de Londres. Impartió clases en la American University en Beirut de 1973 a 1979. Fue profesor de la Universidad de Surrey de 1979 a 93 y entre 1993 y 2008 fue profesor de Política Económica Petrolera en el Centro de Estudios Jurídicos y Políticos sobre Energía Petrolera y Minerales de la Universidad de Dundee, Escocia, una cátedra creada por British Petroleum. El profesor Stevens ha publicado extensamente sobre la economía energética, la industria internacional del petróleo, temas de desarrollo económico y economía política del Golfo Pérsico. En marzo de 2009 se le otorgó el premio PEP en reconocimiento a sus sobresalientes investigaciones sobre petróleo y energía. Escribe en El Economist desde hace muchos años. Paul?
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Good day to everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking El Colegio for the invitation to address you all. It's a pleasure to be back here in Mexico City. I was last here in 1982. There have been a few changes, I think, and I expect to see a few more changes. However, I should warn you that when I left in 1982, a month after I left, Mexico virtually declared itself bankrupt. I'm hoping that there is not going to be any sort of cause and effect on this particular occasion. I've been asked to talk about the sort of global implications of what's happening in North America, specifically in terms of the context of the technological revolution. This is the outline of what I want to talk about. I want to say a little bit about what is the technological revolution. And I have to be careful here. We have a saying in English about teaching your grandmother to suck eggs. And so grandmothers, please stand by your eggs, because I'm going to tell you what most of you know, so I will do it fairly shortly. I then want to look at the immediate global impacts on the oil and gas markets, and then move to future impacts. But before I do that, of course, the key question in terms of the future impact is the question of how the US experience can be replicated outside of the US. Can it be replicated and over what time period? And this will be a key issue. I see a number of people going no, and to give you my conclusion, that is my conclusion as well. That is where I'm coming from. Okay, let's look at the technology. The main components you are familiar with, the extended reach horizontal drilling, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. I've added two others as well, which I think are important and likely to become more important. That is the use of 3D seismic, but also coil tube drilling, I think, has a wonderful future in this. I mean, I've seen those operations where the guy sits in his hut and can direct the drill bit to within half a meter, 3 kilometers away. And if he's sitting there with his map of the sort of 3D seismic, it's wonderful. When I asked them what did it do to the recovery factor, this was a BP operation, he looked at me and said, Paul, if I told you that, I would have to kill you. Look at the smile on my face, however. Now, I'll just mention three characteristics about the technology. First of all, it's been around for a long time. I mean, horizontal drilling was developed in the 1930s. The first well was fracked in 1947. So it's not as though it's particularly new, it's just the way it's been brought together. I think another important point here is the key role for public research funding in the United States. The US government put a lot of R&D money into basic scientific research, and it's worth remembering that fundamental scientific research is a public good, to use the economic analysis of it. In other words, it's the sort of thing private companies wouldn't and shouldn't do. No private company will pay Isaac Newton to sit under the apple tree to discover gravity, because gravity has no commercial value whatsoever, and when you discover it, you cannot patent it. And finally, and again, I think this has been a theme of the whole morning, the technology is constantly improving by learning, by doing. I mean, the story of the shale gas revolution in the United States is a story of technological change and the way in which technology operates. What has the immediate impact on gas markets been? Well, it's obviously had a major impact on LNG, falling US demand for LNG, and a global recession. We mustn't forget the impact of the recession. Has meant that you've been looking at a surplus which emerged in 2009-10. This was partially offset a little bit by Fukushima and Japan's need to go out and buy LNG cargoes. But one of the things it has done is significantly aggravate regional price differences. And you can see that in this slide, whereas in the period from about sort of 2002 up to 2007, you you're beginning to get a convergence of regional gas prices. After 2008, you've got this huge divergence, which is the direct consequence of what's been happening in the United States. One of the consequences of all this is it's created significant uncertainty in terms of future gas markets, which is certainly going to impact itself on investments. It's going to raise question marks about new projects in LNG, particularly with uncertainty over the extent to which the US exports will be on any large scale. Another impact worth mentioning, which is not often thought about, is the impact on petrochemicals. The shale gas revolution in the United States has basically taken an industry which everybody had more or less written off 7 or 8 years ago to a major revival. Now, the global implications of that, of course, is that much of the diversification projects in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC, are based on petrochemicals. And this therefore raises a concern that the developing capacity of petrochemicals in the GCC is going to go head to head with that in the United States. And this could have some interesting implications. Let me turn to the impact on oil. The first thing, and I'm delighted to say this, is one of the things the technology revolution has done is it's killed peak oil forever. At least I hope it's forever. It was a very seriously flawed methodology. Any methodology that talks about this and doesn't mention price and costs deserves to be consigned to the dustbin of history, and basically this is what has happened. Now, the interesting question is, what will the effect of this be on expectations? And here I make a few comments. If you look at the forward curve, between 1988 and 2002, the forward curve on NYMEX was stubbornly between $18 and $20 a barrel over a very long period of time. Then after 2002, as you can see from the curve here, it starts to increase. And one of the interesting questions, which I think has received very little attention, is why did it start to increase? Now, having talked to some of the people that actually sell these future bits of paper, and I've said to them, why were people willing to pay more? One of the responses I got was they said to us, well, we've heard about this thing called peak oil, and we think actually it makes some sense, so we expect the price to go up. Now, if peak oil is dead, what are the expectations going to be, and what are the implications of that going to be? Because the industry, as has been said several times this morning, is all about expectations of price. That is going to drive a lot of basic decisions. Another immediate global impact relates to US crude oil imports. An important point here, which has not been mentioned this morning, is that as the US reduces its oil imports, which it will do, whether it'll go to zero is something we can discuss, but as it reduces it, of course, it has a significant impact on the US balance of trade deficit. It's worth reminding you that half of the US trade deficit is in petroleum, in crude, well, basically in oil. As that goes down to zero, that will have significant implications for the value of the dollar, which clearly is going to have international ramifications. It's also giving rise to a lot of speculation about the impact on US policy. And certainly outside of the US, there's a lot of discussion about, does this mean that the US will no longer have interest in the Middle East? Will it lose interest in policing the sea lanes? Now, I think both views are completely mistaken myself. Superpowers police sea lanes. That's what superpowers do, whether they import oil or not. Also, it assumes that US foreign policy in the Middle East is driven by oil. And I would strongly contest that view. It's driven by a lot of other things. Oil is part of the story, I won't deny it, but there's certainly other factors as well. But the interesting question there is, it doesn't matter what I think, what does someone like China think? If China believes the arguments about sea lanes, then China will clearly want to develop a blue sea navy capability, which it's doing. It may also want to start to get more political influence in its sources of oil supply, and I'm thinking here particularly about the Middle East. So this could have all sorts of interesting possibilities. Another impact is on crude price differentials, and we've heard several discussions of this morning. I'm not going to elaborate on it. There is a growing surplus of light sweet. A lot of West African crude is now switching to Asia. In Asia, the estimates suggest between 2012 and 2020, you're going to get 8 million barrels a day of new refinery capacity. And the interesting point is it's all wrong. It's all the wrong configuration, because it was all based upon the assumption that light sweet would become more expensive and heavy sour would become cheaper. And in fact, the reverse is happening. And for those of you with long memories, you can go back to the 1990 period when refineries in Singapore made the same mistake and made the same assumption and ended up losing there's shirts. And I suspect there's a few shirts going to be lost in the course of the next few years on the basis of this. Now, what about the future impacts? What are these likely to be? And of course, the key issue here is, well, what is the impact of the technology going to be on future supplies? Is it going to be major, major changes? Or is it going to be very much slower? And this depends upon views on how the replicability, sorry, that's a horrible word, how the US experience can be replicated elsewhere. And I've developed a methodology to consider this, and the methodology starts by asking the question, why did the shale gas revolution happen in the United States? And I've drawn up here a list of characteristics. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm assuming that the presentation will be available for anybody who wants to see it. But it lists, in my view, what were the characteristics that allowed the shale gas revolution to happen. And it talks about things like favorable geology, lots of drill core information to identify sweet spots, property rights for the owner. The US is a commodity supply gas market, so it's easy to sell into the market. Pipeline access is common carriage, so again, that makes things easier. And the list goes on and on. So we then say, okay, well, let's think about the rest of the world. What does that look like? And there's no question, and again, we've heard this morning, that there are resources of shale gas elsewhere in the world. Now, if there are any students in the room, please turn your heads away, because this is a very naughty slide. And it's a naughty slide because I'm looking at proven conventional gas reserves, which are in green, and technically recoverable shale resources, which are in red. And as we know, resources are not the same as reserves. And I believe in the US, the sort of rough rule of thumb estimate is about 10% of the recoverable technical reserves is a good figure, okay? So even so, 10% of a large number is still a relatively large number. I should warn you, however, that these numbers are very dodgy indeed. Having spent a lot of time looking at shale gas over the last 5 or 6 years, the definition of a fact in shale gas is anything that appears on the internet, and it's a well-known fact that 83.2% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So a lot of these numbers are really, you wet your finger, wave it in the air and think of a number. Now, a couple of examples here. Last year, the Polish government looked at these numbers and reduced its estimates to 10% of the original estimate. In the opposite direction, in July of this year, the British Geological Survey, which is a very respectable organisation, looked at one shale play in the UK, the Bolan shale play in the northwest, and came up with an estimate of 1,300 TCF, which puts it sort of somewhere on the next floor. Okay? However, having said that, there's enough evidence to say there are a lot of technically recoverable shale resources out there. The key, and this was what Michelle put her finger on, was saying, can you convert that into actual molecules in a pipeline and at a burner tip? And what I've done is I've been doing some research in looking at how these characteristics translate to other parts of the world. And I've done it for the European Union. I've done it for the UK. One of my other hats is visiting professor at UCL Australia in Adelaide. The University College London opened a branch office in Adelaide. I suspect it was because of the wine growing capability of South Australia, which says a lot about British academics, but there you go. And we're doing a similar sort of a research experiment there to see what are in the cells. And of course, the point being, is if you have an MSc project and you have MSc students looking for dissertations, those individual cells make for delightful MSc dissertations. So we've got a number of our students working away to say, you know, is it really no, no, no? Is it question marks? This something, by the way, is something you might want to think about doing here in Mexico, because it is at least a methodology which gives you a flavor of what may or may not be feasible. What we then did in Australia was we said, you know, if we can identify where there are no, no, no's, is there anything government policy can do about this? Can governments step in if they want a shale gas revolution to do something? And we, in fact, produced a green paper 3 weeks ago from UCL Australia, in which we looked at some of the policy options. Now, we know some politicians think they're God, but they're not, and they can't change geology. But they can change the commerciality of the geology. And so, in those sort of terms, you can think of policy implications. So with that what I'm basically saying here is, don't expect the shale gas revolution to occur anytime soon on any scale, virtually anywhere in the world. Obviously, some parts of the world we can discuss are more likely to have it than others. But what are the implications of this for gas? Now, the top right-hand slide is one of my favorite slides. It shows you the global primary energy consumption outside of the former Soviet Union from 1965 to 2010. And what it basically tells you is that between 65 and 90, it was a constrained industry. You see this idea of gas as the wonderful fuel, and yet its market share has hardly changed before 1990. And the reason for this is there were a whole load of constraints on consuming gas. Now, that's another 3-hour lecture which I won't inflict on you. I'll give you one example, is that in 1975 in the European Union and in the United States, legislation was passed that says if you want to build a new gas-fired power station, you can't. Gas is too valuable a fuel to burn. You know, it's the premium fuel argument. You must not use it in power stations. Now, the question is, what happens when those constraints come off? And the best example I can offer you for this is the UK, which is the bottom right-hand diagram. And what that shows is that in 1990, when these and other constraints came off, gas's share in the primary energy mix went from 20% to 40% in 10 years. So as the constraints come off around the world, gas demand is going to increase. And what are the implications of that? Well, there's going to be a significant increase in LNG trade. At the moment, there's fears of competition. I spent a lot of time in Australia over the last 2 years, and whenever I go there, the one question they all want me to give an answer to is how much LNG exports can we expect from the United States? Because Australia has this wonderful situation where, God knows why, they have 7 LNG projects being built. 3 of them are within walking distance of one another, almost literally. And of course, what's happening is the costs of these projects have gone through the roof, and they're all looking distinctly uncompetitive. So there's a lot of interest in what's going on elsewhere. The right-hand side is estimates of LNG capacity from Jim Jensen. So we can expect to see a significant increase in LNG trade, but there is an awful lot of investor uncertainty out there. Would you really, in these circumstances, want to invest the billions of dollars that you have to in an LNG project? There are also pricing issues as well. One of the consequences of the shale gas revolution in the US is that it's putting a lot of pressure on gas contracts where the price is linked into the crude price. In Europe in particular, gas consumers are saying, hang on a minute, why are we paying so much more for our gas compared to the US? It doesn't make any sense. And the reason, of course, is because the oil price has gone up. The big question is the same story in Asia. The question there is, to what extent will the Asian premium on gas prices continue? And there's a lot of debate about this. What about future impacts for oil? Increasing tight oil in the US. The US is going to overtake Saudi Arabia by 2014. I have to tell you, size does not matter in this context. It really does not matter. The reason Saudi Arabia is important in the world oil market, Amrita, you put it perfectly, has nothing to do with the fact it produces a lot of oil. It's to do with the fact that it's willing and able to maintain a level of spare capacity and use that capacity to balance out the market. The US could never find itself in that position. I mean, what were the numbers of how many thousands of producers there are? You're never going to get that sort of replication. Prospects elsewhere are interesting. I mean, one of the areas that I'm quite interested in is the implication of this technology, not to shale oil, but to fallow oil fields. Oil fields that people walked away from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago because they assumed that you'd maximize recovery. Don't forget, on average, globally, the recovery rate is around 33–35%, which means that you've got 2/3 of the oil under the ground. Take this technology and go back to those fallow oil fields, lo and behold, the oil starts to flow again. You are going to get changing trade patterns, in particular from west to east. And we're already seeing this as a lot of West African crude going into the United States is now being diverted into the Asian market. And finally, it leads me to something I've been banging on about for a year or so, which I called OPEC's dilemma. Now, OPEC's dilemma is a very simple idea. Because of the Arab uprisings, the Arab governments need significantly higher oil prices in order to provide the revenue to basically buy off the population, to keep them off the streets. Now, we can argue about what those numbers are, and I take your point, Amrita, about, Ali Assoui has come up with a figure of 94 for Saudi. Probably the Saudis can survive for some time on a lot lower than that. But nonetheless, they need higher prices. And the problem is that higher prices have two impacts. First of all, it leads to demand destruction. And in particular here, I'm very conscious of the fact I disagree very strongly with the IEA and a lot of other estimates of increased oil demand coming out of Asia. If you look at the numbers, about 70% of the increase in oil demand in non-OECD is coming out of the mix. Meet the mix. You've heard of the BRICS. For those of you following the Eurozone crisis, you'll have heard of the pigs. The mix of Middle East, India, China. 70% of the increase in oil demand is expected to come from those three. Why is that significant? It is because for a long time they've had highly subsidized oil products to their final consumers. And that is changing. It's started to change in India in 2002 and started to change in China in 2009. So the higher prices we've seen since 2002 are now feeding into the consumer prices in these countries. In the Middle East, there's talk about it, but now is not a good time to increase domestic energy prices given the political uncertainties. But that will, I think, in turn also come. What this means is that the higher oil prices that we're seeing are going to have an impact. Prices do work, markets work. The second impact is going to be on the supply side. And here I come back to the technological revolution. At high prices, you are going to see significant increases in non-OPEC supply and indeed OPEC supply for those that are ignoring the OPEC quotas. Now that is an unsustainable situation. You don't need a degree in economics to realize you cannot have high prices with lower demand and increased supply. Markets work, and for me it's very reminiscent of a rerun of the period 1981 to 1986. And there are a lot of interesting similarities there. For example, Saudi Arabia has now informally resumed its swing role, although they would deny that in public. But as you showed quite clearly, they are using production to manipulate the market. Again, in 81, 86, there were new oil provinces lurking there waiting for higher prices. North Sea, North Slope, Alaska, and a number of other non-OPEC countries. Now it's the same thing, only of course it's deep water and also the unconventionals. And I could go on with the comparison. So basically what I'm saying is that if we accept the idea that it's a rerun of 81 to 86, we all know where that ended. It ended in the oil price collapse of 86, when Saudi Arabia was neither willing nor able to continue its swing role. At some point, if things continue as they are, this is likely to repeat itself, which means that the oil price comes down, which for a country like Mexico is something that you seriously need to think about. If it does do that, you know, what are you going to do about it? On that point, I will stop. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Pasaremos a nuestros comentaristas. Nuestros comentaristas son muy conocidos por todos ustedes. Entonces nada más los voy a presentar por su posición actual, ¿no? El ingeniero Juan Eibenschutz es actualmente el director general de la Comisión Nacional de Seguridad Nuclear y Salvaguardias. Entonces, le damos la palabra a Juan.
Gracias.
Sí.
Muchas gracias, Pablo. Bueno, quiero empezar por agradecerle a la doctora Toro y al resto de los organizadores la oportunidad de decir algunas palabras breves, pero sobre todo la oportunidad de haber escuchado una serie de presentaciones fuera de serie. De verdad estoy impresionado. Obviamente yo no soy petrolero, no sé si por eso me invitaron. Entonces voy a aprovechar que no soy petrolero para hacer algunos comentarios, tratando de enfocarme hacia las ponencias que hemos escuchado. En primer lugar, quiero relatar una experiencia que junto con algunos compañeros aquí presentes tuvimos cuando participamos en un ejercicio multinacional inventado y dirigido por Carroll Wilson del MIT. Una cosa que algunos de ustedes recordarán, el Workshop on Alternative Energy Strategies. Le pasó lo mismo a nuestro proyecto y a nuestro estudio, que estuvo realmente muy bien hecho, con participación de gente de primer nivel. La conclusión principal de ese estudio, realizado en los 70s, fue que la producción mundial de petróleo iba a empezar a declinar seriamente a partir del 2000. La famosa teoría del peak oil, y todo el mundo, bueno, algunos países le creyeron, luego ya corrigieron el asunto. A la vista de lo que acabamos de escuchar, si este estudio se volviera a repetir, habría una parte que quizá fue la que más nos falló. Se nos olvidó hacer un pronóstico de tecnología. Si hubiéramos visto con mayor claridad los trabajos de investigación y desarrollo que ya se realizaban en los 70s, no hubiera sido tan difícil predecir que esta historia de que para el 2000 se iba a acabar iba a empezar a declinar seriamente la producción de petróleo, por lo menos hubiera sido cuestionada seriamente. En realidad, el concepto que se tiene actualmente, como hemos visto en las distintas presentaciones que hemos oído, es que el fin de la era de los hidrocarburos pues ya no se ve, ya la teoría del peak oil como que ya se murió, ¿no? Probablemente las causas de digamos, de la disminución no serán por falta de recursos. Es la vieja historia de que la edad de piedra no se acabó por falta de piedras. La edad de los combustibles fósiles no se va a acabar por falta de combustibles fósiles. Yo tengo la impresión de que, aun cuando todavía hay discrepancias en esto del cambio climático y los efectos de las energías fósiles sobre el cambio climático, más bien va a ser por ahí, por donde va a haber que realmente cambiar la estrategia. De cualquier manera, Estamos todavía a principios del siglo XXI, y todos los pronósticos señalan que de aquí al horizonte normal de planeación, que anda en los 5 años para decisiones inmediatas y 25 o 30 años para pronósticos que tienen que ver con decisiones de política o de estrategias de desarrollo, el dominio de los hidrocarburos va a seguir ahí, y es muy difícil pensar que será posible hacer algún cambio. La parte que creo que necesitamos tomar en cuenta también es que los avances tecnológicos no han terminado. Es decir, ya escuchamos aquí algunas técnicas novedosas. Escuchamos también que uno de los resultados más importantes de los avances tecnológicos, que hasta ahora no se han mencionado explícitamente, tiene que ver con el factor de recuperación de los hidrocarburos in situ. En realidad, para mi gusto, una de las razones fundamentales por las que México tiene que hacer algo con su industria petrolera es que el promedio de recuperación del petróleo en México es muy inferior al promedio mundial. Y esto tiene varias explicaciones, pero una de las razones es, yo diría dos. La primera es tecnología insuficiente, y la segunda es la rigidez para moverse en términos de aplicación de tecnología con recursos, sin las restricciones que le impone todo el sistema administrativo y el sistema legislativo a la operación de nuestra industria petrolera. Y ahora quisiera referirme un poco a la situación que tenemos en México a la vista de la reforma, y creo que el cuadro que presentó el profesor Steven es muy relevante aquí. Se ha propuesto una reforma energética que está discutiendo, sobre todo en términos filosóficos, diría yo. La parte práctica está razonablemente clara. Es decir, la propuesta de los que dicen que al monopolio petrolero no hay que tocarlo ni con el pétalo de un respiro, obviamente están basados en cuestiones que yo diría simplemente que no son prácticas, ¿no? La soberanía, a mi modo de ver, no tiene mucho, es decir, no se basa ni en una empresa ineficiente monopólica, ni en el concepto básico de que todo lo privado es malo. De cualquier manera, la parte fundamental del reto que estamos enfrentando está en los nos que presentó el último expositor. Es decir, eso se aplica exclusivamente al caso de los shale gas and oil. Entonces, en los Estados Unidos hay sí por todos lados. Y en el resto del mundo hay algunas incógnitas, pero en general es no. Pues yo creo que el reto fundamental que tenemos para una reforma energética en México es, número uno, la cleptocracia. Es decir, el pretender hacer una reforma de los vuelos, de pasar del monopolio estatal a una economía de mercado, si no resolvemos las cuestiones de la cleptocracia, pues es iluso. Es decir, no importa que cambiamos la Constitución y que pasemos las cosas, alguien que me precedió, creo que fue Pedro Haas, dijo que en México somos re buenos para hacer normas y una legislación de primer mundo, de lo más avanzado que hay, pero no sabemos cómo cumplirlo, o no queremos cumplirlo. Entonces, creo que el verdadero reto, y lo que deberíamos empezar a ver seriamente, es que si queremos reformar y queremos tener un sector energético productivo, primero tenemos que buscar otro sistema de administración de la sociedad y de la política que convierta la cleptocracia en otra cosa, porque así simplemente no funciona. Y de hecho, esto lo ha dicho mucha gente, Adrián Leyó entre otros, el pretender transitar de una industria monopólica y propiedad del Estado a una industria caracterizada por el mercado y por muchos actores, requiere un esquema regulatorio casi perfecto, y además requiere abandonar la cleptocracia, porque si tenemos los problemas que tenemos de robos y de pérdida de valor y de comisiones demasiado onerosas y todo lo demás, en una situación en la que el operador es el Estado, si tenemos un regulador corrupto y metemos a los privados, pues vamos a perder mucho más. Y esta es una cuestión que no estoy muy seguro que se haya entendido bien. Yo todavía no he visto una definición clara de quién va a ser el regulador de la industria petrolera, pero creo que es muy importante que pensemos en eso. Y luego hay otros factores, por eso me gustó mucho la tabla esta de los sís y los nos, que no aparecen ahí, o medianamente aparecen, que tienen que ver con el manejo de la industria energética en general. Estamos comentando a la entrada con algunos amigos las dificultades prácticas que se enfrentan para poder operar en el sector energético en general. Esta cuestión del dominio federal, el dominio estatal y el dominio municipal es algo que tenemos que corregir. Es decir, no se puede tener un país moderno y competitivo cuando no hay certidumbre, por lo menos en algunas de las operaciones. Y a mí me parece que este tipo de retos son considerablemente más importantes que la modificación de la Constitución. Y no sé cómo ando de tiempo, pero creo que ya no. No, hay tiempo. Bueno, si me dan chance de hacer un punto más, creo que otra cuestión que debemos corregir y que no se menciona, por cierto, por lo menos hasta ahora en las discusiones que ha habido sobre la reforma energética, es el tratar de manejar las alternativas energéticas desde el punto de vista técnico con objetividad. México no es el único país que pierde la objetividad al tomar decisiones en materia energética. Afortunadamente, en la mayoría de los casos, cuando se toman decisiones sin bases objetivas, la economía las corrige. Es decir, es el caso de España con las renovables y lo que va a pasar en Alemania también con las renovables. Pero en México se nos está pasando la mano, estamos siguiendo ejemplos que ya demostraron no funcionar. Evidentemente yo no tengo nada en contra de la utilización de los recursos de los recursos renovables. Evidentemente es algo que hay que utilizar, solo que cuando oigo los discursos de cuánto renovable va a participar en la satisfacción de la demanda energética de México, me acuerdo mucho de uno de los capítulos del libro de Saint-Exupéry, El Principito, que el Principito se levantaba todas las mañanas y le ordenaba al sol salir por el oriente. Yo tengo la impresión de que aquí en algunas cosas estamos pretendiendo ordenarle al sol que salga por el sur y no va a salir por el sur. A mí me parece que una oportunidad que se ha perdido, sobre todo en el caso de un país como el nuestro, donde la sed de energía es realmente muy importante, está en acoplar la demanda a las características de la oferta. Y existen muchas aplicaciones que permitirían modernizar al país si tuviéramos la oportunidad de cambiar las cosas y no pretender con energía eólica y con energía solar y con otro tipo de energías, satisfacer la demanda de un energético que es el más perecedero, que es la energía eléctrica, simplemente que no se puede almacenar, con los estándares que dan las fuentes confiables. Me parece que ese es un error que nos va, bueno, ya le costó muy caro a España y Alemania. Ahora vamos a ver hasta dónde llegamos, pero creo que tenemos oportunidades de hacerlo mejor. Y creo que con eso ya la dejo, ¿no? Muchas gracias.
El siguiente comentarista es el doctor Vinicio, que también la mayoría de ustedes conocen. Él es el director del Instituto Mexicano. Perdón. El siguiente comentarista es el doctor Vinicio Suro, que la mayoría de ustedes conocen. Él es el director general del Instituto Mexicano del Petróleo y por mucho tiempo ha estado involucrado en actividades de exploración y producción en Pemex.
Sí, muchas gracias, Pablo, y buenas tardes a todos y todas. Primero que nada, mis felicitaciones al profesor Stevens, Skinner y desde luego a la señora Sen por sus presentaciones que realmente informan sobre un tema que yo creo que a todos los mexicanos nos interesa. Déjenme platicar un poquito de las cosas que vi en las presentaciones y al final hablaré de algunas posiciones personales, dado de que a veces es bueno hacer catarsis sobre estos temas. Primero, yo creo que los tres presentadores ponen sobre la mesa el papel presente y futuro de los recursos no convencionales comparados con los convencionales. Y quizá el líder en esta materia pues, es Estados Unidos por todo lo que ha mencionado el profesor Stevens. Pero también es cierto que en el mundo hoy el abasto de hidrocarburos fundamentalmente proviene de convencionales, pero en el caso canadiense es un caso mucho más interesante, porque la mayoría de los hidrocarburos ya proviene de los no convencionales. Eso quiere decir que conforme avancemos en el tiempo, nos guste o no nos guste, dentro del escenario mundial de abasto de energía, los recursos no convencionales jugarán un rol mucho más importante, tal como lo estamos viendo en Canadá. En el caso mexicano, si le llamamos a los no convencionales, a los hidrocarburos en lutitas y descontamos Chicontepec, sucede que el 100% de la producción proviene de recursos y reservas convencionales. Si agregamos el caso de Chicontepec, alrededor son 50-60 mil barriles, deben corresponder a 2.5% de la producción total de líquidos del país, provendría de, digamos, yacimientos que se clasificarían como tight oil o tight gas. Eso a mí me parece muy importante desde el punto de vista de formación de recursos humanos, de aspectos tecnológicos y desde luego de organización. ¿Por qué recursos humanos? Porque si nosotros comparamos la parte de recursos convencionales, los recursos convencionales están altamente concentrados. Son yacimientos, digamos, que requieren un buen número de ingenieros petroleros, geólogos, geofísicos, pero no se compara en nada con la cantidad de recursos humanos que demanda, por ejemplo, la exploración y explotación de recursos no convencionales. Entonces, una parte muy importante de esto es que la demanda de personal altamente calificado, tal como lo presentó el profesor Skinner, va a ser una limitante para la detonación en el futuro inmediato de los grandes proyectos, simple y sencillamente porque la gente no la tenemos formada. Desde el punto de vista de producción de gas, yo no tengo ninguna duda de que la aparición de los hidrocarburos en lutitas ha cambiado el panorama fundamentalmente en Norteamérica. Hace unos años el gas de Norteamérica era el más caro del mundo, hoy es el más barato del mundo. Y eso mueve y promueve el apetito de todos los productores de este tipo de gas de instalar, digamos, plantas de LNG y comenzar a exportar al mercado europeo o al mercado asiático. Y aquí quizá una pregunta para los tres es, dado de que la política de Estados Unidos de una u otra manera ha privilegiado el fortalecimiento de su capacidad de producción, su reindustrialización a partir de un gas barato, y el hecho que al día de hoy solamente haya otorgado 2 permisos de exportación contra los 9 proyectos que están en cierne, mencionados por profesor Skinner en Canadá, ¿qué pasará con el precio del gas? ¿Se globalizará el precio del gas en el futuro una vez que tengamos esas plantas o no? Si se globaliza, me parece que veremos algo muy interesante que el mundo no está acostumbrado, simplemente porque el petróleo lo hemos globalizado, pero el gas no. Y a mí me parece que el paso inmediato y un paso probable es justamente hacia la globalización del precio del gas. Desde luego hay un desbalance entre las necesidades del mercado asiático y lo que presentaba el profesor Skinner. Realmente la producción de gas de Canadá satisface la necesidad de Asia por mucho. Y si ese es el caso, otra vez reflexionamos un poco por el precio del gas. El precio del gas sí va a jugar un papel tan importante como las cuestiones sociales o las cuestiones políticas de esos estados para que realmente tengamos proyectos y podamos vivir una nueva bonanza energética en términos de uso del gas como mecanismo para producir energía. Que incidentalmente, entre otras cosas, si nosotros vemos la cantidad de emisiones de CO2 a la atmósfera de Estados Unidos, es probable que entre este año y el otro año realmente haya alcanzado el pico de emisiones de CO2. Y eso, entre otras cosas, se lo debemos a esos brillantes ingenieros que enfrentaron la producción de hidrocarburos en rocas que anteriormente no eran consideradas yacimientos y que de una u otra manera su persistencia logró la apertura, como dicen los geólogos, de nuevos plays. Por otro lado, aún con todos los problemas, lo que presenta el profesor Skinner es todo una red de distribución inmensa y extensa. ¿Qué significa eso? Con todos los problemas políticos y demás, la industria está apostando a un crecimiento en el futuro inmediato en términos de transportar de manera eficiente sus productos. Las imágenes que presenta el profesor Skinner de los vagones del ferrocarril, digamos, con problemas y demás, pues yo lo que diría es totalmente unfair, ¿sí?, culpar a la industria de esto. En uno fue una inundación, el otro fue un accidente. Bien le pudo pasar a la industria petroquímica y demás. Lo que sí queda muy claro y es muy importante es, no hay mecanismo más barato y más seguro que transportar hidrocarburos por ductos. Entonces, hay que apuntar en esa dirección y desde luego lo que antes pasaba inadvertido, mencionaba también el profesor Skinner de que se construía un ducto, se le daba mantenimiento, se construía un ducto paralelo y nadie decía nada. Yo creo que la sociedad ha sido de una o de otra manera informada en tal medida que ahora cualquier cosa que haga la industria petrolera en términos de producción de hidrocarburos, ya sea convencionales o no convencionales, como industria tenemos que aceptar a dar explicaciones y dar las seguridades que efectivamente nuestra operación es segura y provee beneficios a la comunidad donde trabajamos. Por otro lado, y déjenme tocar el asunto de la regulación. Es cierto que México ha sido débil en regulación. La Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, que regula la parte de aguas arriba de la industria petrolera, fue fundada en 2008. Tenemos poca experiencia en eso. Pero yo lo que diría, justamente por lo que tenemos enfrente de ser aprobada alguna de las reformas, porque yo todavía no la conozco, algunas de las reformas claramente implica en dos de ellas, de las propuestas, la participación de más agentes. Ante la participación de más agentes, no solamente se requiere la profesionalización del regulador, sino la expansión del regulador y crear los mecanismos para que efectivamente su regulación técnicamente sea impecable y desde el punto de vista política sea ligada a las políticas públicas del Estado mexicano. Por otro lado, algunos de los presentadores no les gusta la declinación pronunciada de los yacimientos no convencionales. La mala noticia es que eso es producto del mecanismo de producción. Fracturamos justamente porque la matriz no aporta suficientes hidrocarburos al pozo y entonces tenemos que fracturar. Entonces, lo que vemos en los primeros meses, los primeros días de producción, es los hidrocarburos acumulados en la fractura que rápidamente, por una diferencia de presión, son producidos y más tarde, e interesantemente lo que vemos es una producción razonablemente constante de esos pozos que corresponden justamente a la velocidad de transferencia de los hidrocarburos de la matriz a la fractura. Y esto de una o de otra manera es algo que tenemos que aprender a vivir con ellos. Pero por otro lado no es tan malo. Si queremos valor presente neto, los primeros gastos de producción justamente tienen que ser en los primeros tiempos. Eso ayuda a los proyectos. Lo que sigue después es un poco lo que mencionaba el profesor Stevens, en el sentido la revolución tecnológica. Déjenme darle algunos datos para decirles que la revolución tecnológica no ha sido completada. Entre el 20 y el 50% de los pozos que se perforan en Norteamérica, concretamente en Estados Unidos, no los paga la producción de hidrocarburos. Entre el 30 y el 50% de las fracturas que hacemos en un pozo no producen nada. ¿Qué quiere decir eso? Que la oportunidad tecnológica que tenemos para superar esos problemas sin duda mejoraría los resultados económicos de la industria. Y aquí regreso con la señora Sen en el sentido que a ella no le gusta que las compañías petroleras se endeuden en esas proporciones y muchas veces el rendimiento de capital no está de acuerdo a los incrementos de producción. Y ella lo apunta muy bien, para mantener la producción, dado el ritmo de declinación tan amplio, yo tengo que perforar muchísimo. Pero al perforar mucho, yo lo que diría, si nosotros lo hacemos el análisis económico al tiempo cero, me parece que somos injustos simple y sencillamente porque no vemos los barriles que se van a producir en el futuro. Un mejor indicador probablemente, señora Sen, es con la operación actual, la pregunta es, ¿tenemos un valor presente neto positivo y tenemos una decente tasa interna de retorno o no? Por otro lado, déjenme platicar un poco del futuro, ¿no? Algunos de ustedes mencionaban de que todos los sís del profesor Stevens en el caso norteamericano contrastan con los nos alrededor del mundo. Y déjenme platicarle una experiencia de petróleos mexicanos en los años 1996-1997. Una de las cuencas productoras de gas no asociado es Burgos. En aquel entonces se producían del orden de 200 millones de pies cúbicos de gas. Entre 6 y 8 años después, esta cuenca produjo del orden de 1.6 billones de pies cúbicos de gas. Se pasó de perforar decenas de pozos a perforar centenas de pozos. La estructura de costos inicial para la perforación de esos nuevos pozos no se comparaba en nada con la estructura de costos cruzando el río Bravo. Sin embargo, al cabo de cierto número de años, la estructura de costos se comenzó a equilibrar, porque cualquier cosa que hagamos en términos de recursos no convencionales exige un mercado competitivo y profundo. Hoy en el caso mexicano, con toda claridad, no tenemos ese mercado competitivo y profundo. Todo lo que hagamos de manera inicial seguramente tendrá un costo mucho mayor que el que tenemos, por ejemplo, en la formación Eagle Ford en el caso tejano. Nosotros también tenemos Eagle Ford en el caso mexicano, ¿sí? Simplemente la frontera permite el paso de un lado y del otro. y sin embargo el mercado no lo tenemos. Entonces, cualquier cosa que hagamos, yo lo diría como mexicanos, tenemos que ser lo suficientemente inteligentes para crear los cuadros normativos que permitan competencia y que permitan innovación. Este caso que acabo de escribir sin duda es un caso de éxito. Un caso de éxito que aún con todo el asunto de que no se le paga a los propietarios de la tierra como se les paga en Estados Unidos, porque las cuotas que paga Petróleos Mexicanos están sujetas a una regulación federal, aún con todo eso se pudo lograr eso. Ahora, habiendo dicho eso, ¿cuál es la expectativa o mi expectativa personal de reforma? Pues con toda claridad a mí me parece de que México ya está viviendo desde hace algunos años un cambio estructural y la reforma energética como tal complementará ese cambio estructural. Desde luego, hay muchas cosas que arreglar, ya lo mencionaba Juan, ¿sí? Sin embargo, aún con todo el pesimismo que pudiera rodearnos algunos de nosotros, yo soy optimista acerca del futuro. A mí me parece que un mercado competitivo, un mercado mucho más abierto, trae como consecuencia mayor transparencia. Quizá los primeros años batallemos, pero después de todos esos, la misma apertura del sector, la misma manera de hacer políticas, el hecho de que tenemos una sociedad más informada, necesariamente traerá como consecuencia mayor transparencia. Así que yo creo que la apertura en muchos sentidos hará que Petróleos Mexicanos sea una mejor empresa, comenzando con ser una empresa, y ese es uno de los beneficios que debería traer la reforma, si no es explicable. Y por otro lado, los recursos no convencionales, me parece que tendremos que abordarlos bajo la idea de que los sweet spots que mencionan todos ustedes, que hay que perseguirlos y demás, me parece que tecnológicamente el problema no está resuelto. Hablamos de sweet spots, ¿sí? Pero realmente el problema de las lutitas no es geométrico, es justamente de propiedades de dónde fracturar, ¿sí? Y si fracturamos con agua o fracturamos con otro fluido, y de ahí justamente está el aspecto tecnológico. Y desde el punto de vista, yo diría, estratégico, a mí me parece que al país le hacen falta más jugadores y al país le hace falta producir mucho más. Yo no quisiera tener la relación reserva-producción que el profesor Skinner menciona de Canadá, 150 años. Me parece que es altamente improbable que podamos sacar esos recursos en 150 años. Simplemente la tecnología ayudará a cambiar ese paradigma. De tal manera que yo creo que sí tenemos que hacer más, tenemos que enfrentar el futuro de una manera diferente y desde luego tecnológicamente el problema no está resuelto. La huella ambiental que estamos encontrando en Texas me parece horrorosa y me parece que tenemos que trabajar para volvernos invisibles como industria. Muchas gracias.
Tenemos tiempo para preguntas y respuestas. Oye.
Muchas gracias, Pablo. Yo quisiera preguntarle a Robert Skinner, quisiera pedirle que si podía expandir un poco más sobre las perspectivas del Keystone Pipeline, tanto en términos de ser autorizado como las implicaciones en Canadá de que no sea autorizado. Y por otro lado, no quiero desaprovechar la oportunidad para preguntarle a Vinicio Suro y pedirle a Vinicio Suro que se refiera un poco más al Eagle Ford mexicano. No hay nadie que tenga una visión más madura sobre lo que puede suceder en esa parte de México y sí me gustaría aprovechar su presencia aquí y obligarlo a que algo nos diga sobre el asunto.
Muchas gracias, Adrián, por la cuestión. This question of whether President Obama will say yes to the Keystone Pipeline is dominating the energy news in Canada. Some companies, I think, have made a tactical error by saying it really isn't all that important to us because we have other options. Enbridge is expanding its line to Superior, Wisconsin, and down through the one that goes further east and goes down to Cushing. The Energy East pipeline will get perhaps one of the pipelines to the west. And I think that's been a tactical error because that plays into President Obama's hand to say, well, it's not important, I don't need to make that decision. We've got the midterm elections coming up, and then the presidential election, and what decision does he want to leave for his legacy? I'm probably thinking that about 70% chance that he will say yes in early 2014. The longer he puts it off, the more difficult it becomes. And one of the things that we don't like in Canada is that it's becoming painted in Washington as the Republican pipeline. And with the midterm elections coming, and there are some Republican senators that if they, depending on how you spin this, if you put the Keystone pipeline through, then oil prices are going to go up in some parts of the United States. So you can criticize a Republican senator or a candidate for saying you want the oil prices to go up. You can make it into a demagogic, issue like that. There was something else I was going to say, but my Alzheimer's has. Anyway, it has become all wrapped in politics, and it's a pity because our Prime Minister has said that very strange, he will not accept no for an answer. That, in my 40-some-odd years of working in government and working on the energy scene in Canada, I've never seen the Prime Minister of Canada make such a bold statement. I don't know what he means by that. What's he going to do? I mean, we don't have a standing army, and I'm getting a little old to fight the Americans. The last time we fought them in 16 or whatever it was, in 1812 or whoever it was, we beat them. But this has become a big issue. I don't think. President Obama is relying on his scientific advisory council from Hollywood for advice, and that plays well within his constituency, but it makes it very difficult for Canadians. But if it doesn't go ahead, I think you will see a change in some of the attitudes in Canada that have been kind of not in favor of the oil sands, because this will be. Canadians define themselves as not being Americans, right? So this will be taken as another American slap in the face, and so then there will be support for some of our pipelines, and I think there will be an exerted activity by the federal government to do a financial arrangement with the Aboriginals in the West in British Columbia to make sure those pipelines go ahead, which is a huge issue. The Aboriginal issue is huge, and it's money at the end of the day, and there are ways of dealing with that. So it will set in course a number of developments that I'm not prescient enough to see, but it will be a very negative decision, because it would be a decision that's based not on science, but strictly on the politics of how I appear or how something appears. It is absolutely incorrect that the oil sands will, that pipeline will have a major impact on the world climate. I mean, and I think President Obama, he may have let himself out on that by saying that he would approve it, provided it didn't have a significant impact on climate emissions or whatever. I mean, it's so he can say when the State Department comes out with its impact statement, its final impact statement, which if it finds in the same way it's found before, and say, well, there, it's not going to have a major climatic impact, and so I'm going to approve it. But again, it depends on the political context at the time whether he wants to make that decision. Have I sounded like a politician, Adrian, on that? Okay.
Déjenme abordar un poco la pregunta del licenciado Layú. Yo lo que diría más o menos el número de kilómetros cuadrados que tenemos de la Eagle Ford en México, que no se llama Eagle Ford, nos cambiamos los nombres, o ellos cambian los nombres, dependiendo quién los ve. Son del orden, yo estimo, de 10,000 kilómetros cuadrados, ¿no? Es una cantidad considerable. Tenemos las 3 franjas identificadas en el lado norteamericano. Tenemos una franja de aceite, una franja de condensados y una franja de gas. Las experiencias de Pemex perforando el área iniciales son mixtas. Tenemos buenas áreas, tenemos áreas que no producen, etcétera. Pero eso sin duda refleja el estado de conocimiento que tenemos sobre el área. Es un estado de conocimiento incipiente que hay que trabajarla de otra manera. Platicaba en la anterior intervención de la definición de sweet spots. Sweet spots, digamos, cada uno de ustedes tiene una definición, yo les voy a dar la mía. Es una zona que está saturada de hidrocarburos, que es propensa a ser fracturados y que su tramo donde está saturado debe exceder 2-3 kilómetros para perforar el pozo horizontal. Y el problema es que las tecnologías actuales, la sísmica tridimensional, sin duda ha ayudado a definir la geometría, pero yo insisto que el problema no es geometría. Las lutitas son horizontes muy continuos, bien controlados y demás. Ese no es el problema. El problema es dónde tengo más propensidad a las fracturas, dónde tienen los hidrocarburos. Entonces, la apuesta que estamos haciendo como Instituto Mexicano del Petróleo es abandonar el concepto solamente de utilizar sísmica tridimensional y abordar el asunto de fracturamiento y contenido de hidrocarburos con sísmica multicomponente. Uno de los fenómenos muy interesantes que estamos viendo es que el precio de adquirir sísmica multicomponente está cayendo. Esto lo va a hacer rentable y me parece que una pieza de información adicional para disminuir la incertidumbre es justamente la sísmica multicomponente. En términos de futuro, pues ya lo he mencionado, tenemos que trabajar muchísimo para conocer los mecanismos de acumulación de esos hidrocarburos, qué es lo que hace una zona mejor que otra. Muchas veces no solamente es fracturamiento, sino es la saturación. Y yo lo que diría que tenemos un largo camino por recorrer en el área de la Eagle Ford, al sur de Piedras Negras, pero las consecuencias para el área van a ser enormes. Por ejemplo, el municipio de Guerrero, ahí viven 500 personas. La población económicamente activa deben de ser de 100 personas. Comenzamos a adquirir 1,500 kilómetros cuadrados de sísmica y se crearon 10-15 empleos para el área. El presidente municipal de allá me habló para darme las gracias porque incrementé la población económicamente activa entre 10 y 15%. Ahora, imaginen ustedes con una operación masiva cambia radicalmente las condiciones de esos pequeños poblados. Si hoy me preguntan si las autoridades están conscientes de lo que va a ocurrir en términos de suministro, de servicios educativos, de instalaciones sanitarias, de suministro de agua, me parece que ahorita estamos en el umbral de reconocer qué es lo que viene, pero también por estar en el umbral deberíamos de hacer las preparaciones adecuadas para enfrentar el futuro de mejor manera. En conclusión, la Eagle Ford penetra a la parte mexicana. Todos los elementos que tenemos nos hacen predecir que tenemos una riqueza muy similar a la mostrada en el lado norteamericano y que los resultados que tenemos muestran que tenemos un conocimiento incipiente y que lo tenemos que acelerar con el propósito de tener una operación económicamente sustentable. El otro problema que se va a enfrentar es el problema del agua. El problema del agua, el área de Piedras Negras no es una área, digamos, como puede ser el norte de Veracruz, con agua. Los acuíferos identificados por la Comisión Nacional del Agua son acuíferos localizados hasta 1,500 metros de profundidad, y lo que hemos venido diciendo es de que el suministro de agua tiene que ser de acuíferos mucho más profundos, que la misma industria tiene que conseguir los permisos para producirlos, tiene que ser agua que no sea potable y tiene que ser agua que no compita con la comunidad. Si se logra esto, yo razonablemente estoy cierto que se puede lograr, yo creo que vamos a tener una operación sustentable en el área. Pero, digamos, no lo debemos esperar de manera inmediata y al segundo año de cualesquiera de las reformas que pasen. Me parece que tendremos que ver un comportamiento, digamos, un poco más lento que el de Burgos, porque Burgos ya tenía infraestructura. El área de Eagle Ford en la parte mexicana no tiene la infraestructura que tenía Burgos. Por consiguiente, tenemos que ser pacientes y tenemos que generar conocimiento para tener una operación sustentable y sobre todo crear los mecanismos de comunicación con las comunidades locales simplemente para trabajar de manera armónica. Ese sería mi comentario.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Tenemos tiempo para una más.
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta. Es una pregunta para los tres. ¿Qué le pasará al precio del gas si Estados Unidos va adelante con sus 2 plantas de licuefacción y los canadienses también? ¿Veremos un escenario de globalización de los precios del gas o qué pasará?
That's a very good question. We should see some arbitrage between markets. I mean, it would defy economics, right, Paul and Amrita, if there wasn't some arbitrage. However, I have said that for years that it is very difficult to imagine that we would have a global natural gas market like we have a global oil market. In fact, you posed the question, maybe we should have 2 global oil markets, a heavy oil market and a light oil market, and maybe we may be going in that direction. But 10 years ago, I gave a talk in Paris, and I said that the North American market is quite different than other natural gas markets. It's very dependent on weather. The volatility is dependent on weather. And we have a hot summer in the United States. Gas prices and how much gas goes into storage is very dependent on that. And I just asked the question, where in the world is LNG being exported from a competitive natural gas market that's traded and where storage is traded and transport is traded? Where in the world is LNG exported from that kind of market? And where in the world is LNG exported from a market that is very, very cold in the wintertime? Nowhere. So, 10 years ago, if you looked at the FERC website, there was over 32 billion cubic feet of LNG import terminals being proposed in North America, Mexico, Canada, United States. In March 17th of this year, there were over 32 billion cubic feet a day of export terminals proposed for North America. The natural gas industry in North America has gone up and down, inside out and around for the last 60 years. What evidence do we have that that chaotic past is now over for the future forever?
Can I just, again, step back a little bit? If we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s and looked at oil markets were very much as gas markets are today. In other words, they were very regional. That started to change in the 1970s, and the main reason it changed was because the cost of transporting crude oil relative to the price of crude oil fell dramatically. In other words, transport costs became a small part of the landed cost, which means you only needed fairly small price differentials between the regional markets to get physical arbitrage. Hence, we now have an international oil market. So, to answer your question, for a gas market, you have to say, what are the prospects for a significant reduction in the cost of transporting gas? And unless somebody has a sort of beam-me-up Scotty machine out there, I can't see it. In other words, we're going to have regional gas markets for quite a long time. Do you want to?
I'm fine. Let's go to
Head's bursting to get it.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question. But I think there are things that you can do to zero in on it. So I several different ways to zero in on it, done by different parties, and they've all come up with more or less the same answer. Some of it has to deal with what Bob was talking about with the North American market. It is a market, and the U.S. has pushed out almost 10 BCF a day of Canadian natural gas, and as the U.S. exports, it's going to pull in Canadian natural gas. So there's going to be, on the supply side, a significant balancing element that's going to keep a lid on where the price will be. And you also kind of have to think about some things that really are different, Bob, namely that the Marcellus is producing 12.5 BCF a day. The amount of seasonal volatility in the marketplace has shrunk really dramatically. And it's shrunk dramatically because what we used to think of as consuming areas are producing areas. And partly it's a result of that. Storage in the U.S. Gulf Coast is at record levels because there's not enough place to put it, winter or summer, shoulder season or peak demand season. So, I think there is something dramatically different about this market than what used to be the case. To the degree you can model something, and the AGA has done it, Michelle has done it, we've done it, and we've come up more or less with the same answer. IHS has done it, and come up with a slightly different answer. But if you try to look at all the moving parts, you've got to look at when will directional drilling move between oil and natural gas in the North American market. We had some discussion earlier today with Pedro on the 6-to-1 ratio rule. It looks as though if you do a modeling of the entire system, bearing in mind that there are a lot of liquids associated with the system, including things that are also being exported or feeding petrochemical plants, it looks as though a company that is indifferent in its options between gas drilling and oil drilling will be indifferent at natural gas at 550 and WTI at 90. Now, I say that from a modeling perspective. I've also tried this out with 3 companies that I know of that absolutely have that optionality, and they have exactly the same conclusion. 550 is the number with a $90 oil price where a company would be indifferent, and that's important because you need to know what price will drive the drilling to release the supply. So if you try to think about that, and then here's where the AGA certainly has a published number, we have a published number, others have a published number, somewhere between 550 and 6, you really do get enough gas release. And then you have to look at what the arbitrage would be. If Henry Hub is 550, what is the European gas price and what is the Asian gas price? And then you have to do a further calculation. So if you do the add-ons on what the cost is, clearly you have to start with, what is the natural gas? So let's say it's $5 and $5.50. Then you have to add the liquefaction, the physical cost of liquefaction, and the physical cost of transportation. Then there's a very funny fourth number, which is the capacity charge. So the capacity charge is what is required for the owner of the LNG liquefaction plant to recoup all of the capital costs that have gone into the project. Well, that's a pure accounting number. It's an accounting number based on the number of years of amortization.
Yeah, it was.
The mic is dead, sorry. So if that $3 capacity charge is a fudged number, you need the prices in Europe to be maybe under $9 per million BTU, and prices in Asia to be maybe 11, depending on what happens on the west coast of North America, and depending on what the cost of transit through the expanded Panama Canal might be, and nobody knows the answer to that.
Thank you.
Bueno, señores, son las 1:45, entonces vamos a pararle. Volvemos a este salón a las 4 de la tarde para la mesa número 2.